When Charles Follen McKim, the visionary architect behind the Boston Public Library, approached American artist John Singer Sargent with the ambitious idea of creating a series of murals for the library, Sargent paused and exclaimed, "But I have never done anything like that before," expressing his doubts about stepping into the unfamiliar world of large-scale public art. Yet McKim's confidence in Sargent's genius was unshaken, and the artist soon accepted the challenge, embarking on what would become one of the most significant projects of his career. Before selecting Sargent, McKim and the Boston Public Library trustees considered other prominent artists for the library's mural decorations. Among them were Puvis de Chavannes and Edwin Austin Abbey, both revered for their works on a larger scale, but it was Abbey who would be the principal collaborator with Sargent to perform the awesome task of decorating the walls, lunettes and cornices. While these artists were assigned specific areas, Sargent was eventually invited to create murals for the third-floor Special Collections Hall, later known as the Sargent Gallery. His murals, part of the larger vision for the library as a palace for the people, added a dramatic and deeply intellectual layer to the building's aesthetic, making it one of the most important cultural landmarks of its time. It was through the refined cultural circles of the late 19th century that Charles Follen McKim, the visionary architect behind the Boston Public Library, first encountered the brilliant John Singer Sargent. McKim had long admired Sargent's unparalleled ability to capture light and form, his portraits imbued with a vitality that seemed to breathe life onto the canvas. The library, conceived as a palace for the people, demanded nothing less than the finest artistry, and McKim believed Sargent could rise to the occasion. Fellow American artist Edwin Austin Abbey, the famed American illustrator with a flair for dramatic storytelling, was tasked with transforming the book delivery room into a visual epic of the Holy Grail. Sargent was assigned the third-floor Special Collections Hall, where he took on the challenge with his characteristic dedication, crafting a monumental mural series that would be known as The Triumph of Religion. This extraordinary work, at once dramatic, intellectual, and deeply symbolic, cemented Sargent's place not just as a master portraitist, but as one of the great muralists of his era, ensuring that McKim's vision for the library as a beacon of art and knowledge would endure for generations. It was 1890 when Sargent first set his sights on the monumental task of painting murals for the Boston Public Library, and even as he began to conceptualize the triumph of religion, Sargent's hands were far from idle. The early 1890s saw him at the height of his career, creating masterpieces that solidified his reputation. Among them was Carnation Lily Lily Rose of 1885 to 86, the brilliant study of two young girls lighting lanterns amidst a twilight garden. Though completed a few years earlier, its success still echoed in the art world, affirming his extraordinary mastery of light and atmosphere. Around the same time, Sargent also completed the strikingly modern Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth of 1889, a dramatic theatrical portrait of the actress in full costume, capturing both her commanding presence and the intensity of Shakespeare's tragedy. Sargent also unveiled Paul Hellieu sketching with his wife, a charming yet intimate portrayal of his close friend, the French artist Paul Hellieu, absorbed in his work beside his wife. The painting's casual grace and immediacy stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of his looming mural commission, revealing the breadth of his talent. As Sargent embarked on the Boston murals, he brought with him the lessons learned from these masterpieces and his numerous studies of architectural buildings and reliefs from Spain, Italy, and Egypt. When John Singer Sargent undertook the monumental task of creating the triumph of religion for the Boston Public Library, the figures that emerged on the walls were not just products of his imagination. They were inspired by the real people who posed for him, their likenesses immortalized in his sweeping grand vision. It is in the quiet of his studios both in London and Boston that Sargent worked, sketched, and developed his broad ideas for each lunette, and space provided for him, calling upon a diverse array of models to bring life to his dramatic compositions. Among them were professional models, their practiced poses lending the anatomical precision and grace required for the twisting bodies and expressive faces that peopled his murals. In Boston, for example, it is likely that Thomas McKellar, an African-American model, worked with Sargent extensively on these projects. Though records of individual models for this large work remain scarce, it is known that friends and acquaintances often played a role. Sargent, known for weaving themes of the familiar into the mythical, occasionally invited those close to him to serve as the foundation for his allegories. At times, when no one else was available, or when a precise gesture or expression eluded him, Sargent turned to his most reliable model, himself. Using a mirror, suggesting the nuances of movement, the subtle interplay of light and shadow and gesture. It is interesting that as Sargent stood at the peak of his career, his time was split between two monumental undertakings that could not have been more different in theme or purpose. On the one hand, he was immersed in the decades of love with his Triumph of Religion, a sprawling mural series begun in 1890. On the other, the eventful outbreak of World War I called him to create Gast, commissioned at the behest of the British War Memorials Committee, which by 1918 much of the series had taken shape. Sargent travelled to the Western Front, amidst the devastation of trench warfare, depicting a haunting procession of soldiers temporarily blinded by mustard gas, their eyes bandaged as they stumble toward a dressing station under a pale, unsympathetic sky. The scene is both harrowing and deeply emotional, capturing the quiet endurance of soldiers in the face of unimaginable suffering. The war temporarily pulled him away from the Boston murals. He returned to his labour in Boston. In these two works, one capturing eternal questions of faith and spirituality, the other bearing witness to the transient horrors of war, Sargent's genius shone through, leaving a legacy as timeless as it was multifaceted. Sargent took on his projects with monumental ferocity. As he did with all his work, he was punctual, thorough, and imaginative. Classic, modern, and daring. Words that ideally describe his unique abilities and artistry. As we look over the mural designs and sketches toward the finished product, it would be interesting to note the financial arrangements credited to him for the undertakings he employed. It is noteworthy at this point to elaborate a bit more on the details of the projects. Sargent was paid approximately $40,000 for his work on the Boston Public Library murals. This sum was a significant amount at the time and reflected the scale and prestige of the project. Adjusted for inflation, $40,000 in the late 19th and early 20th centuries would be worth over $1 million today, underscoring the importance of the commission. The funding for the murals came from the Boston Public Library trustees and private donors who supported the library's vision as a palace for the people, where art and knowledge would coexist. Despite the generous payment, the project was a labour of artistic passion for Sargent, who spent nearly 3 decades intermittently working on the murals, investing far more time and effort than the financial compensation alone might suggest. Sargent was paid £1,000, about $5,000 in today's money, for his Gast painting, which was commissioned by the British War Memorials Committee in 1918. The amount was a relatively modest fee for a work of such monumental significance, especially considering the scale and emotional impact of the painting. The British War Memorials Committee had set a budget for artists creating works, and Sargent's fee was in line with other commissions. However, the work became one of Sargent's most iconic and widely celebrated pieces. The undertaking by Sargent to commit to such a large project after many years as a highly successful portrait painter, and one that fought the critics at times for not having more depth into the sitter's personality, it remains that Sargent was not a mere recorder of the obvious, as some have suggested, mere facts, however masterful, they grant him. But on the completion of the Boston Public Library, as his profits were put in place, It was applauded that at one large stride the portrait painter took front rank in the unusual and exacting field of mural decoration. His strength of characterization, even to the point of palpable dramatic power, the great decorative project, was painted with a suavity and covered with an ease that could not be greater if its dimensions had been in inches instead of feet. And despite the compelling interest in the figures, it is first of all, and in the best sense, decorative. One great mural painting followed another, as each was installed in its appointed place. In addition to his Boston Library efforts, in 1917, Sargent exhibited personal works. This would be the fifth that Sargent exhibited in Boston. The collection comprised about a dozen oil paintings, half a dozen watercolours, and 30 drawings. There was a private view that was crowded, and in the midst of it, Sargent himself, who had doubtless been persuaded to be present rather against his inclination, beat a hasty retreat. Nevertheless, a very handsome sum was realized for the sale, and again showed his remarkable skills and heroic work ethic that firmly established him as one of art history's greats. And then we have the story that became a gift. In the Corcoran Gallery at Washington, there is a sketch portrait of Daniel J. Nolan, painted in 1917, and the history of the making of this head, as related by Mr. Coburn, is not without interest, as revealing certain genial characteristics of the two men, the artist as well as the sitter. It appears that Dan Nolan, who was an expert restorer of pictures, received one day from Sargent the latter's early portrait of Frederick P. Vinton. The picture, made in the early 80s, had cracked badly, and Sargent wished to have it properly restored. This Dan Nolan did, making a good job of it. When he delivered it at Sargent's studio, he refused to take payment for his work, saying, "It's a tribute from one great artist to another." This gesture rather pleased Sargent. At dinner with friends a few days later, he told about the incident, and remarked that since Dan refused to be paid in hard cash, he must think of some way of rewarding him for his services. "Why don't you do Dan's portrait?" suggested one of the artists present. "There is nothing in the world he would treasure so much as that." "Do you really think he would care for it?" asked Sargent. When Sargent proposed to Dan to make a charcoal head of him, Dan had the nerve to offer an amendment, hinting broadly that he would prefer a sketch in oils. "Don't you like my drawings?" asked Sargent. "You know I love them, Mr. Sargent," was the reply, "but I am thinking of my descendants, and how your picture would be better kept for them. You see, my wife and I are both Irish, and in our household we sometimes have family discussions. Now, if she should throw her shoe at me, and it happened to go through your charcoal drawing, it would be spoiled forever. But if it just dented an oil painting, I could always fix that up as well as I did the Vinton portrait." Sargent, who was not without a sense of humour, was amused, saw the point, and readily agreed to make the desired oil sketch. Across the top of the canvas is the inscription, "To my friend Daniel J. Nolan." Boston and Cambridge continued to keep the painter busy on mural work. He had not completed the public library decorations before a commission for the decoration of the rotunda of the Museum of Fine Arts came to him in 1916, and this last undertaking was not finished until 1921. Consisting of 4 large oval panels, 4 smaller panels to fill circular spaces, 4 bas-reliefs, and 4 unframed bas-reliefs that make up the sum total of this scheme of decorations. The entire series was in a much lighter vein than the Boston Public Library work, and gave an impression of freshness and ease, yet for the better part of 5 years the painter toiled with unremitting industry over this commission. He would often be at work by 8 o'clock in the morning until nightfall, never idle. His attention to every minute detail of the work was indefatigable. He spent many days constructing a complete model of the rotunda. He made small-scale studies of every panel and innumerable drawings from life. In all ways he showed a characteristically tireless determination to perfect his work through endless study, experimentation, and revision, to bring all its parts into harmony and unity. Upon completion, Boston art critics were invited to a press preview of the mural paintings in the museum in 1921. Thus, Sargent ended a difficult but grand finish with acclaim. And we leave you with these words: "Heroic, yet magnificently simple in design and execution," wrote John Oliver. "The purity and nobility of the classic is combined with that modern and highly original style, in both pattern and colour, which has always distinguished this great master." In the present case it seems as if he had never felt the fatigue of the effort. The figures appear to have evolved themselves in their proper places. Finally, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of the muralist John Singer Sargent. He continues to be as popular today as he was during his lifetime. Thank you to our subscribers, and remember to leave a like to help the channel. Also, there is a link below for any donation amount. So, with that, it's bye for now.